Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of How Did We Not Know That? I'm Nat.
I'm Jack.
And I'm Indeep.
Yay!
Yay!
Hi, everyone. Welcome. We are really excited. We have our first guest ever today. She's our very good friend, Indeep. Indeep and I actually met while we were studying abroad in Senegal. So she's going to present today on a topic of her choosing. Take it away, Indeep.
Okay, so a fun thing is that neither Jack nor Nat know my topic, so I'm really curious to see how they react. So to open, I have a question. What is your guys' worst nightmare?
If I had to give like blood repeatedly, like over and over and over.
Okay. And Nat?
I'm really scared of like open spaces, like the ocean. I'm really scared of the ocean, actually.
That's interesting. Yeah. So mine
It's like gonna use it against us later.
Could you imagine? I feel like
that's
mine...
not the topic at all. Go ahead.
No. Mine would probably be having unanesthetized gynecological surgery without my consent. Okay, so the title of my presentation was going to be, I was between reproductive politics or how women's bodies were the original battlegrounds of how men, especially American colonizers and slave owners, gained and kept their power and influence.
Wow.
That's heavy, girl.
You guys, I don't come here to play. I come here to let you know, to spill the tea. And the tea is going to be spilled. This is a rabbit hole. And I'm sorry you're not going to be the same once you come out. And I hope that's okay.
Oh my gosh, yes. I feel like American history, just like the more I study it, the more I'm like, yikes.
And I also think it's funny that like there's just these little things that are just like, oh, we never even thought about that. And it's actually like this huge problem that still affects people. But something I also want to highlight before I kind of get like into the stick of the presentation is how the resistance to these is sometimes documented, and I really want to like highlight it as we go through, because I don't want to like erase the stories of the victims and dehumanize them. And so I want to kind of highlight that these are people who exercised their will when they could, and they often did so like against really scary odds and really powerful institutions and forces. So as we're like going through this, we're going to just highlight the resistance and highlight the fact that these were people, It all starts with our guy, James Marion Sims, AKA the father of modern gynecology. And I feel like we all just feel weird about there being someone with the title, the father of modern gynecology, right?
I don't like that.
That's upsetting.
Sims practiced medicine at a time when treating women was considered distasteful and rarely done. And, no one's surprised. And he invented the vaginal speculum, which is a tool used for dilation and examination. And we're all thinking, oh, okay, cool. And he also pioneered a surgical technique to repair vesicovaginal fistula, which is a common 19th century complication of childbirth in which, okay, get ready, a tear happens between the uterus and the bladder, and that causes constant pain and urine leakage. And so this still happens today in developing countries, and it's really avoidable. And it literally happens when a baby is stuck for too long and they like wear a hole next to your vagina, and it can happen like next to your bladder or next to your literal anus, and it causes like leaking. And I know no one thought this was gonna happen, but when it happens, it happens. And it's a really big problem like in developing countries, because people who have this problem are often like, first of all, the baby usually suffocates and dies. I know, because they're in there for days. Like that's how long it takes, right? And also like they're often what's the word when you're like excommunicated, like thrown out of the tribe, thrown out of the village. And I know
because they can't have a baby because it's stuck.
Because their baby died, and because they smell bad. Because after this happens, they like it's just really gross, and they like have
Because it's leaking. Okay.
Exactly. And so I think they think of it as like a curse, or sometimes it's just like kind of distasteful to have around, and they're just kind of like banish the woman. And this is like really, first of all, this is really easily repaired by surgery, just some stitches, you know. And also, okay, I don't want to reduce that. I don't know how it's repaired. I'm assuming it's just stitches. But also, it's really preventable. Like if you just have something kind of take the baby out, you could do a C-section. Like there's a lot of ways to like get the baby to come out now. But you know, if you just don't have any resources.
Oh, sorry, what year is this that he's inventing this? Do you know?
So he's inventing this. He was born in 1813. So I think he was inventing this in the 1830s, 1840s maybe.
Cool.
Wait, question. Sorry. He's American? So the father of gynecology is American?
Yeah.
Okay.
And he was born in Lancaster County, South Carolina in 1813. And he entered the medical profession when doctors didn't undergo the same rigorous coursework and training they do today. After interning with a doctor and taking a 3-month course and studying for a year at Jefferson Medical College, he began his practice. He later relocated to Montgomery County, Alabama, seeking a fresh start after the death of his first 2 patients. I know.
The third time's a charm, right? Just got to move to Alabama so they let him have that third try.
I know. The father of modern gynecology. So it was in Montgomery that Sims built his reputation among rich white plantation owners by treating their human property. This article does not play. According to Vanessa Gamble, University Professor of Medical Humanities at GW, George Washington University, Sims's practice was deeply rooted in the slave trade. And while most healthcare took place in the plantations, some stubborn cases were brought to physicians like Sims, who patched up enslaved workers so they could produce and reproduce for their masters again. Otherwise, they were useless to their owners. And this kind of brings up this concept of soundness. Being a sound meant that you could produce and reproduce. So men could produce and women could reproduce. For women, having fistula made them less sound because they couldn't really reproduce as much. It goes into the whole slavery and childbearing, which I'm going to get into. But just to finish on our guy, James Marion Sims, there's a lot more on him if you're interested. He started like the first women's hospital, killed a bunch of people, saved some people, you know, and he had, I think, 3 statues of him that are starting to come down. So there was one of his statues was literally in Central Park, opposite the New York Academy of Medicine in New York City. And this was removed on April 17th, 2018, and its current plaque will be replaced by one that educates the public on the origins of the monument and the controversial non-consensual medical experiments he used on women of color, mostly enslaved Black women. The names and histories of 3 known women whose bodies were used in the name of medical and scientific advancement by the doctor. Their names are Lucy, Anarcha, and Betsy, will take their rightful place on the new plaque. And I will also mention he did his experiments on slaves without anesthesia because it wasn't invented at the time. And also because, they didn't think that Black bodies felt pain the same way that white bodies did, which is still a myth that happens to this day. Like to this day, Black people are given less anesthesia on average than like their white counterparts because they believe that Black people somehow feel less pain. And that's James Marion Sims.
Jeez. Oh my God. That's so upsetting that like not only is he this awful person, he killed all these women and like none of his surgeries were like consensual, but how did he get all these statues? Like
I have no idea. What I do know is that I don't know, like he started doing surgeries on white women and he did make a lot of advancements because before nobody would even delve into women's reproductive, like they were like gross, you know. And then he started doing surgeries on white women with anesthesia because, you know, handily it was invented and also, you know, white women feel pain, apparently. Who knew? So
not me. That white side of me doesn't feel pain, so I don't know what you're talking about.
So I can just delve into slavery and childbearing because, you know, this is all of this research was just a hole that I just dug deeper and deeper into. It just doesn't end. Everything that I'm going to say is excerpted from Birthing a Slave, Motherhood and Medicine in the Antebellum South by Marie Jenkins Schwartz. So here's like a little bit of background. As of 1808, Congress ended the nation's participation in the international slave trade. So that means that the only practical way of increasing the number of slave laborers was through new births. So if enslaved mothers did not bear sufficient numbers of children to take the place of aged and dying workers, the South couldn't continue as a slave society. And as we know, slavery lasted a lot longer than 1808, right? So they really made it work.
Slave trade ends in 1808.
Yeah, the slave trade, like the international slave trade ended in 1808.
So like within
We had like 60 years of they're just like breeding more slaves now.
God.
Exactly.
Breeding is a terrible, I'm sorry I even use that word. Like,
no, but that's a word that's used because it's like, you know, it's not humane, like the way that this is, right?
Literally looking at it as like numbers, like they're not looking at it as like human beings. Like,
yeah, they're looking at them like livestock. Is like,
literally.
Disgusting. Oh my God.
But rewards for motherhood followed the birth of children for like female slaves who give birth, right? So these included extra clothing, exemption from harsh punishment, and even rarely, freedom. Some women were able to avoid field or other arduous labor as a result of bearing children. A breeder, so these women were called breeders, always fared better than the majority of female slaves. And there were repercussions for barrenness. So young women who had not demonstrated fertility faced the possibility of separation from family, as well as additional labor. If a married couple lived together for long without having a baby, owners would force husband and wife to choose new partners. And it's also like a former slave, his name is Henry Bobbitt, maintained that many marriages did not last longer than 5 years because if no children were born within 5 years, husbands and wives were expected to find other spouses. So from the standpoint of enslaved women, the slave owners' foray into the scientific management of their bodies, AKA just like interest in their reproductive systems, represented something beyond benevolence. I think none of us are surprised. It was an effort to decrease the importance of women's community and to substitute the ways of white men for those of Black women. And I found that like really interesting, just the way that was worded. It's like, that's literally what's happening, but white men trying to make like Black women's reproductive systems work for them. The women struggle to assert their own customs. So rather than acquiescing in slaveholders' demands that they bear as many children as possible, enslaved women attempted to regulate childbearing to accord with their own notions of the proper timing and frequency of motherhood. In resisting the dominion of white men in this regard, Black women cast themselves as central actors in the unfolding drama that constituted slave life and culture in the antebellum South. So essentially, like the fact that these women like wouldn't always have children whenever it was demanded really, really shaped the narrative of like how slavery continued. Because as we know, like it is only through these women that slavery could continue.
I'm like speechless just because like, oh my God, like you're literally like manipulating and like forcing yourself like on every aspect of like slaves, like on their bodies and like women especially, like that's so violating and like dehumanizing. And like I can't even like imagine how like painful and just how horrifying and disgusting that is. Like it's really upsetting to hear about. I don't know. I'm like,
yeah, and like just the pain of childbirth and childbearing and everything you have to go through with that, and then the bond that like mothers feel with like their children, and then your child is literally just being treated as livestock. I'm sure like I've read things where they get separated at birth and like the child gets sold maybe to another slave owner. It's like horrific.
yeah.
It is crazy. It's crazy to think about like whatever children you have, like you're not going to have any rights to them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And literally like just being thought of as like an experiment and like something like a test subject, like, oh, that's so disgusting and that's so scary. Like I'm just like, even like giving birth to a child, like any woman in this time,
I know,
absolutely horrifying. Like I can't even imagine. I'm like so scared. Like I would be so scared either way. And then in this setting especially, like, oh my gosh, I wonder how many, like, are there any statistics and like how many like fatalities, like how many women died because of this? Although I guess this probably wasn't documented.
it's hard to tell because I don't know how much they would have like actually documented, you know, other than like to suit their own needs, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, history is like documented by the winners, as they say. And like,
Right.
especially they're not teaching slaves how to read and write. It's hard to find any documentation at all. I'm actually impressed that there's at least documentation on this so we know about it.
I know, it's crazy. I think that a lot of it also honestly came from like the descendants of like slaves, because a lot of this was like told through stories. And I think it's just like, I don't know, even we're going to go like through a few more subjects, but even just like the way that like people are researching these things, and it's so important to research. It makes me have such respect because I feel like this is so traumatizing to research about and like write about every day, you know?
Mm-hmm. And very painful for them to like relive those experiences, to share the story, to that, for that to be documented.
Yeah.
That's so true.
On to the next phase. And so, you know, I have another question for you, you two lovely young humans. When you think of the 1970s, what do you think of?
I think of like the hippies and like I think of Vietnam War, and like there's a lot of like unrest and people are upset.
I think of like the start of the end of like social Darwinism and like the end of the eugenics practices. Well, so we believe the end.
Yeah, Jack is ready. She knows how this goes.
It's because I'm studying the Gilded Age right now, so I'm like learning about everything that was put in place, and then it's like ending in the 70s.
So I just want to refresh you guys on Roe v. Wade. Happened in 1973. And it was a landmark decision of the U.S. Supreme Court in which the court ruled that the Constitution of the United States protects a pregnant woman's liberty to choose to have an abortion without excessive government restriction. Some hot tea. And so we can get into some like of the background. There was this woman, and her pseudonym was Jane Roe, and she became pregnant with her third child, and she wanted an abortion. But she lived in Texas, where abortion was illegal, and so she filed a lawsuit on her behalf in the U.S. federal court against Henry Wade, who was her local district attorney. And so basically they heard the case, they ruled in her favor, and then Texas appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, which agreed to hear the case, and they ruled in her favor, which meant that federally abortion is legal. Abortion in the United States is legal nationally, but abortion laws are also like under state jurisdiction. But technically, like it has to be illegal in all states, but it's regulated by the states.
Yeah.
So I kind of wanted to highlight this because I felt like this is like the struggle that we hear about, but this is a struggle of white women, as I'm going to kind of like go into more. Like the struggle was different for different populations of women of color. And it's kind of crazy how different the struggles, like they were just not even the same, like not even the same issue. And we're going to start with Indigenous women. I'm going to start with a fun statistic. In the 1970s, doctors in the United States sterilized an estimated 25 to 42% of Native American women of childbearing age, some as young as 15.
That number is insane.
Crazy.
I don't even, did you find out anything like on the process? Was it like, were they using like armed forces to like pull women from their homes? What was it?
So what they would do is like, women would go in for, you know, maybe like a procedure, maybe like a checkup, often just like giving birth. And then while they were giving birth, there would be a quick procedure that was, yeah. And oftentimes it would happen without their consent, even knowing. Sometimes it would happen like technically with their consent, but it was like they didn't know, like they were just told it was birth control. They didn't know that it was permanent. They didn't know what it really meant, you know. Although the practice is primarily associated with Nazi Germany, North Korea, and other oppressive regimes, the U.S. has had its share of forced sterilization laws that fit with the eugenic culture of the earliest 20th century. And I want to define eugenics real quick. It's a science that tries to improve the human race by controlling which people become parents, which is a great law if I've ever heard one.
Oh my God. You do not want a voice bit of you saying this.
I know.
It's going to come back when you have a campaign one day.
I need to be more careful, but also, I'm like literally sweating. It's so funny. How crazy that is. Okay. So here's the timeline of some of the more notable events from 1849 until the last sterilization performed in, get ready for it, 1981. 1981. So,
recent.
Quite
No,
recent. So in 1849, Gordon Linscomb, so he was a famed Texas biologist and physician, and he proposed a bill mandating the eugenic sterilization of the mentally handicapped and others whose genes he deemed undesirable. So although the legislation was never sponsored or brought up for a vote, it was the first serious attempt in US history to use forced sterilization for eugenic purposes. Between now and 1907, there were a few other attempts at passing a forced sterilization law, but none of them passed. And then 1907, Indiana, Ohio's neighbor, for you who do not know, Ohio State University, where we all go and went,
Go Bucks.
right next to Indiana. In 1907, Indiana became the first state in the country to successfully pass a mandatory forced sterilization law, impacting the feeble-minded, a term used at the time to refer to the mentally handicapped.
Okay, I really did not realize, because I've looked into forced sterilization a little bit, but I didn't realize it, there are laws being passed about it. I always thought it was just kind of shady,
Yeah, on the DL.
Yeah, that's horrifying that there was a literal law.
So in 1909, California and Washington both passed mandatory sterilization laws. In 1927, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Buck v. Bell that laws mandating the sterilization of the mentally handicapped did not violate the Constitution. And Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes made an explicitly eugenic argument in writing for the majority. It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. Oh my God.
Straight out of Sparta, where they used to leave handicapped out to die by themselves, or the sick.
Literally, that's insane. And we've talked about Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes in our Is It Free Speech or Espionage episode. And when I was doing research, none of this came up. They were just oh, he's a really influential judge. Yeah, probably because he literally said that. Oh my God, he
literally. Isn't it crazy? Okay, so this next fact is fun. In 1936, Nazi propaganda defended Germany's forced sterilization program by citing the U.S. as an ally in the eugenic movement. World War II and the atrocities committed by the Nazi government would rapidly change U.S. attitudes towards eugenics. I guess that's what it takes. I don't know.
Okay, T. Actually, Nazi Germany took a lot of our practices as inspiration for their practices. I don't know if you guys know about the gasoline baths at the border between Mexico.
Border?
Yeah, at the border between Mexico, they would bathe Mexican immigrants who are waiting to get citizenship. They'd bathe them in gasoline to clean them. Those cleaning chambers were inspiration for the gas chambers in Nazi Germany. I'm probably gonna have to cut this out because that's a whole nother episode and can of worms. But yeah, that stuff happened.
Oh my God.
That's crazy. I had no idea.
Yeah. Anyways, continue, please.
So the Nixon administration dramatically increased Medicaid-funded sterilization of low-income Americans, primarily those of color. While these sterilizations were voluntary as a matter of policy, anecdotal evidence later suggested that they were often involuntary as a matter of practice. Patients were frequently misinformed or left uninformed regarding the nature of the proceedings that they'd agreed to undergo. None of us are surprised. So in 1979, a survey conducted by Family Planning Perspectives found that approximately 70% of American hospitals failed to adequately follow the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services guidelines regarding informed consent in cases of sterilization. I think the only thing that's surprising to us is that there was guidelines on sterilization. I think we're this just doesn't make sense. And then in 1981, Oregon performed the last legal forced sterilization in U.S. history. Crazy that it was Oregon and California and Washington who really stand out.
It's all still America. We're all in it together.
She's right. Okay, so that was a brief history of a brief overview of the history of forced sterilization in the U.S. And now let's go back to Indigenous Americans. In the 1970s, doctors in the United States sterilized an estimated 25 to 42% Native American women of childbearing age, some as young as 15. So the sterilizations, subsidized by federal government and often undertaken without consent or under great duress, marks the culmination of a long history of efforts by federal and local authorities to manage the reproductive lives of Native families. And this is explained by Brianna Theobald, She's an assistant professor of history at the University of Rochester. And her new book, Reproduction on the Reservation, Pregnancy, Childbirth, and Colonialism in the Long 20th Century. She says, the federal government and local authorities have long tried to control Indigenous families and women's reproduction using tactics such as coercive sterilization and the removal of Indigenous children into the white foster care system. There was this mindset, this really fun slogan that I feel like you guys might have heard, kill the Indian in him and save the man. And that's the mindset under which the US government forced tens of thousands of Native American children to attend assimilation boarding schools in the late 19th century. And I feel like the boarding schools we've heard of, and I think it's interesting, why have we heard of the boarding schools and not like forced sterilization? Like, I don't know.
Yeah, or the adoption era. Yeah, Indeep, you're really hitting like all the good topics. I feel like every little bit you say, we could literally make into a whole another episode. And we will, because it deserves to be spoken about more. But yeah, the whole adoption era with Native Americans is like horrific. And then the boarding schools lasted, do you have like the date of how long they lasted? But they lasted a very long time. I don't even think that they were completely shut down like by the 70s. I don't even know if they're still shut down. Who knows?
Yeah, well, yeah, and like these boarding schools were like awful, like, well, first of all, because like they're separated from their families, so that in itself is awful. But then additionally, like they're forced to, I guess, convert to Christianity, and like they're not allowed to speak their native language. They're like forced to speak in English only, so you're wiping out like people's culture. And
when they return, like sometimes they can't even communicate to their parents anymore because they don't remember. They were taken away so young, so they don't even remember their like native tongue.
And they're
crazy.
And a lot of them like died in the boarding school just because of proper care. Also, like, I don't know if you're gonna touch on this later, but like a lot of what's happening, like these boarding schools and the forced sterilization of Indigenous women also happened at the same time period in Canada as well. And that
I didn't know that.
Really, this was actually the first time I'd ever heard the term forced sterilization before, was when I was in Canada, like working there, and the Canadian Parliament were drawing up a lot of reports and doing a lot of research on the history of forced sterilization of Indigenous women. And there was a lot of efforts towards reconciliation about the boarding schools and this forced sterilization and like bias of police towards like against Indigenous people of Canada. And so like I remember like when I heard the term forced sterilization for the first time, like this was like 2 years ago too. I was like, I never even knew this was a thing. And then I was like doing all this research on it, and they're like, oh yeah, this happened in the US too, of course. I'm like, this happens up until 1981, so it's not even like, oh, it was just so long ago. Like yeah, I just wanted to note too that like this is so widespread.
Yeah, and I think that's important to note, because I feel like a lot of us don't, like I don't, have even like a frame of reference, like this is so new, just like the concepts that we're covering. Ooh, Jack said something that I wanted to touch on. She said, okay, so Jack mentioned how this podcast, like this episode, is touching on like a lot of other things. And I think that kind of speaks to how like women were like, and women's like reproductive, like freedoms and reproductive, just like the control of their reproduction was like an underlying factor in a lot of other things, but it was never really spoken about, right? Like this is like this underlying current, this underlying theme that happened in like a lot of different like periods of US history and a lot of different oppressions. It's just something that like has never been spoken about. So when you're just focusing on this, you kind of see that it threads throughout like US history, which I think is like really interesting and also crazy but unsurprising that it's not talked about, because it combines misogyny, like no one likes talking about women's reproduction. Like it's just, I mean, no one, I love it, but like men have historically been a little uncomfortable around it, and it speaks about like other marginalized identities, being different race, people of color, enslaved. So I think it's just like so interesting how all of these kind of become this really like this underpinning oppressive ruling, like this oppressive policy,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think just like to add on to that, it shows how history, because we all have said this before, but like history is a rabbit hole, and you cannot, like history does affect multiple things throughout time. And that's why it's important to study history, because it's not like these events happen in like little pockets. One event will like lead to another event, which leads to another event. And they all throughout generations are going to affect future people.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And I kind of want to talk about the resistance of Native American women, because we want to always humanize people and also just like not take away their agency even in the retelling. So until mid-century, mid-1900s, there was a tremendous resistance in some areas to the acceptance of government physicians. The women might tell the field nurse, yes, I'll come to the hospital, and then wouldn't. It's actually quite funny to read the documentary record. These field nurses would write in their reports and that they were frustrated that women who were visibly pregnant would just lie to their faces and say, no, I'm not. I found that so funny. In an effort to maintain reproductive self-determination, to keep reproduction in these gendered and generational networks where they believed it belonged. In the 1930s, Susie Yellowtail, a Crow woman, took up midwifery because of her dissatisfaction with her own birthing experience at a government hospital. And another example was the establishment of the American Indian Movement, or AIM, in 1968 in Minneapolis. This was an intertribal group. Oh, you guys know about this?
Yeah, Nat covered AIM in the there was a Native American Civil Rights Movement episode. Please continue.
And so you guys have already covered it, and it's just one of several militant groups that became associated with what's called the Red Power movement. And in the 1970s, Native activism and resistance became very visible, more widespread, and ultimately coordinated nationally and internationally. And that's when Native women really started to organize independently. They formed the Women of All Red Nations, WARN, the group that especially took on these sterilization abuses. Under pressure, the U.S. Government Accountability Office investigated the issue in 1976. They released a report which actually stopped short of saying that government divisions performed sterilizations coercively, but it did raise a number of concerns regarding the consent process. And in the aftermath of this report, amidst Native activism and also activism by African American and Latina women, the women who were like most poignantly affected, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare adopted new regulations that offered some tangible protections for women, which went into effect in 1979. That's the tea about their resistance. So the last topic for today is Latino women. And between the 1930s and the 1970s, approximately, 1/3 of the female population of Puerto Rico was sterilized, making it the highest rate of sterilization in the world.
Yeah,
Nat, did you know about this?
Yeah, I just read this book called How to Hide an Empire. I plugged it in one of my mini-sodes, but like literally like they go over all the forced sterilization and like other, I guess, like medical experiments conducted on Puerto Ricans at the time, and but like just 1/3 of the population, like that's so hard to comprehend. And like, yeah, is it okay? Also, can only women be forcibly sterilized? We don't have to keep this in the episode. I'm just like very.
No, that's a great question.
Yeah, men can too, but forced sterilization usually applied to women. And I think it's kind of for obvious reasons. I feel like birth control usually is like the women's burden, you know? And also I feel like if a woman is giving birth, it's easy while you're already in there to kind of like have another operation.
That's true.
If I had to guess, I would guess that men were also forcibly sterilized, you know, especially like ones who had disability, like kind of we said earlier, feeble-mindedness was considered.
Okay, yeah, I was curious.
So some argue that the pressure to increase sterilization procedures in Puerto Rico was a targeted practice to decrease the high level of poverty and unemployment because the government blamed these issues on overpopulation. The legalization of contraception in Puerto Rico and the Puerto Rican government passage of a law allowing sterilization to be conducted at the discretion of a eugenics board both occurred in 1937. I know. Soon after the legal change, a program endorsed by the U.S. government began sending health department officials to rural parts of the island advocating for sterilization. And by 1946, postpartum sterilizations happened frequently in various Puerto Rican hospitals. However, a year later, a study found that 1/4 of the women who had been sterilized regretted the decision. If 1/4 reported that they regret it, like I'm thinking like how many women are missing in this.
Yeah, how many were surveyed even?
Right.
Accurately reflect the true feeling of women.
Right. But even, I don't know, even if it was just 1/4 is still a lot of people. And Catholics and nationalists fought against the sterilizations in the 1950s, which eventually resulted in the law being repealed in 1960. And also, I thought this was really interesting. In Puerto Rico, family planning clinics could be found in factories that provided free sterilization thanks to a USAID grant, which is...
Wow.
I know.
What's an AID grant? What's that?
USAID, like USAID. USAID,
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
It's for the listeners who don't know, I guess, because it's not a very well-known government agency. It's a federal agency that is kind of in charge of like international aid. I interned with them a few months ago, and it's just not a good look. It's not a good look. They don't do this anymore, but you know.
Yeah.
I was like, ow. Through this program, Puerto Rican women became the guinea pigs for U.S. pharmaceutical companies who were developing the modern birth control pill. Once again, mixed feelings, because it's not like birth control, like modern birth control and the pill like has helped a lot of women, but like this history's so dicey. I feel like at the heart of it to remember is that whether or not it's good or bad depends on like the opinion of the woman who's like affected by it, because it gets so confusing, because it's like birth control isn't good or bad, you know, and like sterilization or whatever the procedure's called now, it's not like good or bad depending on like whether you want it or you don't, and that's it, you know.
That's true.
Right, so I think it's an important distinction, maybe to treat women as humans. I don't know, maybe.
Thought. I don't know, Indeep, that's pretty radical.
And it's controversial. It is radical. So forced sterilization was also common in California. So there was this one case, Madrigal versus Quilligan, in 1975. That was a federal class action lawsuit in which these women fought back after being sterilized without informed consent or under duress. And so these women kind of refers to Latino women, Latinx women. There was Dolores Madrigal, who was one of the 10 plaintiffs in the case, and she was told that her sterilization could easily be reversed, which I can't. Jovita Rivera and Georgina Hernandez said that they were pressured into agreeing to the procedure after being intensely criticized by doctors and nurses for being poor and having children. These are haunting stories, but especially the one of Lavina Hernandez, who she didn't even find out that she'd been sterilized until years after her son was born. At the heart of the case was the question of whether women were coerced into being sterilized, and if so, if Latinos were targeted. And at the end of the trial in 1978, the judge ruled that, get ready for it, neither of the charges were true, citing misunderstandings due to the fact that the women primarily spoke Spanish. The judge blamed their distress from the procedure on cultural background that made these women believe that their worth was in their ability to have children. So basically, he was like, nah, they weren't coerced. Nah, Latinos weren't targeted because, I don't know, they spoke Spanish and they also felt that their worth was in their ability to have children.
That's so messed up.
What year was that again?
1978.
Oh my God.
I know.
Oh my God.
Another cause of the decision was that voluntary informed consent was not a legal requirement, which is crazy, until 1974, after the case was decided. Although the Latina women did not win the case, Madrigal changed state laws and helped to solidify the careers of various Latino politicians. So, you know, not nothing. Okay, so, and that's kind of all the history that I have. I just kind of wanted to chat a little bit about the effects of these, like how they still last today, and how, I don't know, I feel like for me, there's like a lot of things that kind of affect us personally that, you know, maybe we should be thinking about that we haven't really like, that aren't really conversations that are had. And some of these questions are like what it means to be a woman and how being a woman is inherently political. And that's true because, you know, women are like marginalized. There's the pay gap. There's a lot of policies that kind of kind of hurt women's ability to be equal members of society, and also a woman of color, and what it means to be able to control one's own reproductive future. Because I feel like we talked about before, like it's even scary, like even just having children is terrifying, you know, and even just like the responsibility of that is terrifying. But the fact that like we're able to control that on an individual level and how powerful and privileged even those concerns are is like really crazy to think about, you know?
Yeah.
So I don't know, let's talk about those things. I feel like, do you guys have any thoughts on those?
That's a really good question.
I guess, yeah. I mean, like, you can't ignore the ways in which women, especially that layer of color, the ways in which people of different color have been treated historically, and the way that your gender will affect like what jobs you can take, and that this is like societal pressure, but also there are actual laws in place that like keep you from having the vote. They keep you from having government representation. They keep you from getting to study certain subjects in school. Yeah, there's just like so many layers. And when you're talking about all the ways in which there's been like sterilization of different colored women, I also want to add too, I know like Asian women are not super part of this narrative. And a reason that could be is because with the Chinese Exclusion Act, like Asian women were not allowed to enter the country during this time up until the 1950s. So, there's so many other layers, and Asian women are not excused from this. There are lots of things that were happening over in East Asia and Southeast Asia too. And this is something that affects everyone globally. And Melinda Gates and like Michelle Obama all do a lot of work with like girl empowerment around the world. And it's proven time and time again, yes, with statistics that whoever suffers the most like in our global sphere is going to be like a colored woman.
Yeah, I guess like to add on to like intersectionality of like gender and race, like this does not surprise me that I have not heard of a lot of this before, because like I feel like the feminist movement in general and like women's history in the US is so whitewashed, and like we only learn about white women in the US. I just can't get over the fact that this was happening until the 80s. No one's talking about it, especially like coming from Canada, where like they're doing so much research and so much reconciliation efforts and like just trying to bring awareness to the issue and like educating the people on this topic. The efforts are a lot weaker here compared to what I've seen in Canada, at least that I'm aware of.
Going off your point, Nat, Indeep, I want to ask, did you discover any like reparations that have been made to make right these wrongs that have happened?
Yeah, I think that there has been an effort towards reparations. I'm not sure exactly which population. I do remember there was mentioning about how some families who were affected by forced sterilization, I think it might have been indigenous families, where they tried to give them reparations. But at the same time, I think that there was also talk about like how it isn't entirely successful, implies like you can't make up for that, There is a consensus that like the reparations are not ideal, but I think that reparations were like attempted by the United States. I don't know, how can you repair, like I just feel like it's impossible, because white history built on itself. So how can you repair like breaking down a whole civilization? Just the current state of the United States would be entirely different. Like there's nothing you can do to fix that, bring that back, or like make it okay,
Right. There's value too, though, and that attempt should still be made. I think like a lot of people will use that argument and they'll be like, well, like each generation should start fresh and there's nothing we can do. It's in the past. No, each generation is not starting fresh though, because of the past. So there should be a continuous effort to make those reparations. And okay, I was like because I was watching a finance video, as you guys know I love, and we're talking about the economics of what it's like to graduate in a recession. And so think about the 2008 financial crisis, all of those people graduating the recession. And now it's projected, these are statistics, it's not my opinion, they have lower earnings, they have less probability to start a family, less probability to buy a house, because they were like slammed with these loans, and lower pay wages because you're graduating in a bad job market, less opportunities, they're not in the same places as their parents were for building wealth for their families. And that's nothing that they did. I think we all can agree economically, you got dealt a bad hand. And it's not anything that you did. You went to school, you did the right things. And if you can think about that, and then you can shift your mind to understand that that's exactly what happens to people of color. It's nothing that they're doing wrong, or anyone in any oppressive. I'm from Appalachia. Appalachian is white working class. There have been problems with that group as well. There are white immigrants as well who have dealt with things. But the point is that like sometimes things are not within your control that have happened to you, and now you're dealing with all of the repercussions of that throughout generations, and that's nothing that you did wrong, and that's up to us who are in positions of power and privilege to help in any way that we can, if that makes sense. That's how I see it.
That's some hot tea. I 100% agree. I do realize that that argument is an argument to not making reparations. I think I was just being a little bit like, how could you ever,
I understand. Yeah.
But that is a good point. And I think that I should be like a little more mindful of the way that I kind of say like, oh, but you can't even do it, because that is a good point. It's not possible to completely make up for what's been done. But if there's no effort, then like you're just still doing it.
Well, it's like population control is something that's so permanent. Yeah, like you said, how can you make up for it? But at the very least, we could at least educate ourselves and like promote awareness. How are we supposed to come up with not a solution necessarily, but like how are we supposed to respond to this and like help promote change if like no one knows about it,
Yeah. So we already touched on this, but I also want us to think about how some of these practices and problems may be ongoing, and the repercussions of them are definitely ongoing in the US. This is obvious that these policies were not written by the people who were affected. The fact that I'm still surprised when I see women of color in Congress tells us that like we're not at the point where the communities that are affected by policy are an equal representation of the ones making the policy. I guess those are my remarks. And how are you guys?
To add on to that, I recently read an article by the New York Times talking about healthcare bias towards Black women in like the healthcare sector and how more women of color had died during childbirth because, kind of like you mentioned earlier, perception of pain, there's a bias that people of color, women of color, don't feel as much pain. So if women say they're in pain or there's something wrong, they're not going to be believed as much. So like that's another thing that's like, oh, there's still a lot of issues ongoing today. Thank you so much, Indeep. Like that was incredible and like so comprehensive, and like I learned so much. And there's so many topics that you brought up that I want to look into. Maybe we could do it in future episodes. Like everyone encourage you to do like individual research too. Like we mentioned, there's still ongoing violations of women of color's bodies, so don't forget.
Don't forget. And also, it was my pleasure.
Thank you, Indeep.
Thanks, guys. It was I can talk about women's reproductive health and intersectionality and I can literally talk about it all day. Like we found my passion.
Yeah, we're bringing you back for another episode. You know it.
You know I would love it.